For all the time apologists spend trying to prove Christianity's central claim, that Jesus really did rise from the dead, very rarely do they ever stop to ask what the belief in Jesus' resurrection actually meant to the earliest Christians. This is a massively important question to anyone interested in the larger historical question of how Christianity began and why it took the shape that it did. And you'd think that with all the material evangelical scholars like Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and William Lane Craig have produced on the resurrection, they'd be all over this question. But aside from trying to demonstrate the general truth of Christianity, they don't seem to be. Why is this? The great French New Testament scholar Alfred Louisy once remarked on the tendency that modern theologians have to read the New Testament from a great distance, sifted through the experience of 19 centuries, and to find in it only those elements that have been least worn out by time. I strongly suspect that that's what's going on here. This is another one of those places where I can't help thinking that the relative silence of the evangelical industrial complex on an important question betrays the shape of that industry's confirmation bias. So I want to take this video to briefly look at what the resurrection meant to the earliest Christians, at what it means to most Christians today, and at how the difference between those two emphases highlights a deep problem within traditional Christian faith. For most Christians today, the primary significance of Easter is found in the confidence it gives them in the hope of life after death. For many, that hope is seen through the pervasive lens of Platonic dualism, the idea of our souls leaving our bodies behind at death and floating off to spend eternity in a disembodied heaven. While there's some support for this in a few later texts, it's definitely not what the earliest Christians had in mind. Of course, there are many other Christians who are much more grounded in the biblical idea of bodily resurrection. So the point of Jesus' resurrection to these Christians is the anchor it provides for a much more substantial and holistic expectation for the world of space, time, and matter. That what God did for Jesus in the middle of history, he will do for all of creation at the end of history. If you would have asked me a few years ago what the resurrection meant to the earliest Christians, this is basically what I would have said. And following scholars like N.T. Wright and George Eldon Ladd, I probably would have added a note of inaugurated eschatology, that although we don't know when God's kingdom will come in fullness, Jesus' resurrection brings that future kingdom to bear on the present evil age, giving believers victory over sin and empowering them by the Spirit to do their part in building for the kingdom. It's a beautiful idea, and it's very close to what the earliest Christians meant when they said Christ is risen. It's certainly a lot better than the popular Platonic hope of going to heaven when we die, but it's still missing something. In fact, it's missing the most important element of early Christian hope. For the earliest Christians, the primary meaning of Jesus' resurrection was that the long-awaited climax of history had finally begun, and thus that the general resurrection, the final judgment, and the restoration of creation were just around the corner. It meant that the fallen kingdoms of this world were on their last breath, and God's kingdom was coming at last. And they didn't mean this in the abstract, ahistorical sense that modern theologians mean when they talk about inaugurated eschatology, but in the real, concrete sense that all new millenarian and apocalyptic movements mean it before the problem of delay forces them to renegotiate the basic meaning of those words. When the earliest Christians talked about Jesus' resurrection, they did so within an environment of intense expectation for the imminent establishment of God's kingdom. And the establishment of God's kingdom meant, among other things, the bodily resurrection of all God's people to live in God's new world. Like many other Jewish sects at the time, they were an apocalyptic movement following an apocalyptic prophet. They were fueled by a fervent hope that all wrong things would be made right, that the wicked would be judged, and that the persecuted and martyred saints would be raised up and given authority over all the nations. So when Jesus' original followers came to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, the cash value of that claim to them was that it safeguarded their prior expectation that the resurrection of the dead and the restoration of creation were just over the horizon. It was like the first shoots of grain sprouting up from the soil at the beginning of the harvest season, showing that the full harvest is right on schedule. This is what Paul means in 1 Corinthians 15 when he speaks of Christ's resurrection as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Of course, 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the most important passage about the resurrection in the whole New Testament. And it's easy to see when reading that passage that there's a close connection in Paul's mind between the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of all his followers. But what modern theologians often fail to recognize is that this isn't just a logical connection, but also a temporal connection. When Paul says that Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, he means that the full harvest, the destruction of death itself, is just around the corner. This is why, earlier in the same letter, Paul says that the appointed time has grown very short, so much so that people shouldn't try to change their present circumstances. Those who are unmarried shouldn't seek a spouse, and those who are slaves shouldn't seek their freedom, because, he says, the present form of this world is passing away. For Paul, the end of the age has begun in the resurrection of Jesus. It's grinding against the present evil age, and the time when all of creation will be lifted from its bondage to decay is actually so close that the normal pursuits of human life, like marriage and freedom, would be a complete waste of time. The close temporal connection in Paul's thought between Jesus' resurrection and the general resurrection is clear also in another famous passage, in what might be the earliest book in the whole New Testament. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 5:11, we learn that Paul's converts in Thessalonica were troubled by the fact that some of the members in their community were growing old and dying. They expected Jesus to return in their lifetime, and so the deaths of these members created a cognitive dissonance that needed to be resolved. We can see the early church struggling with this belief that Jesus would return and fulfill all of God's promises within that first generation throughout the New Testament. The earliest gospel, Mark, attributes a number of sayings to Jesus that show us where that expectation likely originated. In Mark 9:1, for example, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." And in Mark 13:30, he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." All these things there, including the coming of the Son of Man and the gathering of the elect from every corner of the earth. It's very likely that these sayings of Jesus, or something very close to them, are what's behind the anxiety that Paul is addressing in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. And as scholars like E.P. Sanders and Dale Allison have pointed out, Paul's response seems to draw on the same tradition. Notice that Paul prefaces his response by referring to it as the word of the Lord. And notice how much of the language and imagery of that response mirrors the language of Jesus' eschatological sayings in the Gospels, such as the appearance from heaven, the angelic trumpet call, the gathering of the saints, the thief in the night, sudden destruction like labor pains, and the need to keep awake and be sober. All of this makes it highly likely that the word of the Lord Paul is drawing on here is the same sayings tradition behind the Olivet Discourse in the Gospels. And this is significant for a number of reasons, but the thing I want to highlight here is this, that the main way Paul comforts these early believers in Thessalonica when they're struggling with doubt because of the apparent delay of the Parousia is by reminding them of the firm basis of their hope in Jesus' resurrection. They need not be shaken concerning the timing of the Lord's coming just because some have died. They should stay alert and full of hope, knowing that we who are alive and remain will soon meet those who have fallen asleep. Why? Because Christ's resurrection guarantees it. The hope of the coming of the kingdom of God and the gathering of the saints that Jesus insisted would take place within that generation has been vouchsafed by the resurrection of the Messiah, like the first fruits of the harvest. So again, the significance of Christ's resurrection in one of the earliest surviving Christian documents was that it guaranteed the resurrection of all God's people in the very near future. It was the first stage of a single two-stage event, giving a foretaste, a down payment, a guarantee of what was right around the corner, within the lifetime of Jesus' first followers. And there's every reason to think that this understanding of the resurrection goes back behind Paul to the earliest Christian communities. Dale Allison argues this at length in his phenomenal new book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. As Allison says, we have every indication that shortly after Jesus died, certain adherents of the new faith held what the Germans call a Nährvortung, that is, an imminent eschatological expectation. Jesus, they believed, would soon return, the dead would rise, and God would repair the world. Yet they also believed that the Messiah had already come, that prophecies had been and were being fulfilled, and that even now they enjoyed the eschatological gift of the Spirit. Such a concentration of beliefs, which combined near expectation with elements of what C.H. Dodd called realized eschatology, would almost inevitably have yielded the idea that with Jesus' resurrection, the resurrection of the dead had commenced. Now, obviously, this way of reducing dissonance in the years immediately after Jesus' death couldn't be maintained in later decades after the first generation of Christians had completely died off. And that's why later texts like John 21 and 2 Peter 3 offer more radical reinterpretations of the original prediction. And that's why the meaning of the resurrection starts to change as well, so that in texts like John 14, we can see a shift from the temporal, horizontal assurance of Christ's imminent return to the more spiritual, vertical assurance of going to heaven when we die. And so when Christians today talk about the meaning of Easter in the Platonic terms of life after death, or even when more sophisticated Christians talk about it in terms of God doing for Jesus in the middle of history what he will do for the whole world at the end of history, in both cases, they're following a long tradition of rationalization and reinterpretation after the fact, a tradition that goes back in many ways to the New Testament itself. But when we give the New Testament writers the basic dignity of expressing their own thoughts within their own historical context, instead of making them say what we want them to say, we can see that the original meaning of Easter, the meaning it carries in the earliest surviving Christian documents, was that the long-awaited climax of history had come at last, and that all God's promises of worldwide justice and restoration were on the verge of being fulfilled right then and there. For them, in other words, Jesus' resurrection was proof that it was the end of history. And after 2,000 years of delay, I think it's safe to say that they were clearly, unequivocally wrong. Whatever they experienced in the days immediately following Jesus' death, the eschatological scenario that controlled their interpretation of that experience was just as much of a myth as the three-tiered universe that, as we saw in another video, controlled their understanding of where Jesus is now. So once again, as with the Ascension, we can see that there's a very deep problem at the heart of Christian faith that resurrection apologetics has routinely obscured, or more often simply ignored. And it's a problem because if the earliest Christians were wrong about the meaning of the resurrection, why should we think they were right about the substance of the resurrection? How much confidence can we have in their testimony about what happened in the days immediately following Jesus' death, when their interpretation of what happened has been so thoroughly discredited by the unbiased hand of time? And if their understanding of their experience was so clearly dictated by a myth, then how do we know that same myth didn't generate that experience in the first place?